Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Dr. Frank, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Barbara Franke. I'm a professor of molecular psychiatry at Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and also at the Donders Institute in Nijmegen. I'm a biologist by training and very interested in ADHD since, I think, 2004.
Well, that's all. I about to say it got wide acceptance. I feel like in the past 8 years, 10 years, it started becoming more normalized. And maybe that's just my opinion because I'm looking through research studies. I'm seeing things from like 8 years, 12 years. I've seen prior ones before dated back a little bit earlier, but it seems like from a lot of researchers I talked to, it became more accepted in society 8, 10 years ago. So how'd you come across ADHD and how'd you get interested in learning more about it?
Well, actually, it was quite a coincidence, actually. A colleague of mine and mentor of mine, Professor Jan Buitelaar, came to Nijmegen. He switched universities, came to Nijmegen. And my boss in human genetics department thought that we would be a good fit together in terms of collaborating. Because Jan Buitelaar also wanted to look into genetics, and this is where my primary expertise lies. And we started collaborating, and I found the work in ADHD very stimulating, and a lot of things indeed that needed addressing. So I stayed with it since.
Now, was it as widely accepted? I mean, obviously now it's different, but I mean, back then, I mean, did you look into it like what is ADHD? Is it a real thing? Is it something like that? Like, did you have that kind of stigma that a lot of people have towards it, or were you just like, yeah, it's real? I mean, how hard is it to get people to look at studies about ADHD? Probably back then it wasn't so easy.
Yeah, well, I think by then acceptance was definitely there for childhood ADHD. But I remember a grant that I got reviewed where the reviewer was saying that was on ADHD in adults, and the reviewer was just saying, well, what is she analyzing? Because ADHD in adults doesn't exist. So ADHD in adulthood is definitely something that at that time wasn't accepted and still is not known by many adults that you can actually have ADHD also as an adult.
Was
Oh,
ADHD,
if you look,
I about to say, was ADHD something that they knew was a genetic factor, like people were born with ADHD, or did they think it was like a trauma induced?
um,
Because it does show up in our genetics, I'm pretty sure.
it has high heritability, but it's not like you're necessarily born with it. It's a combination of genetic factors, genetic liabilities, and environmental factors that in many people come together and then cause ADHD.
What are some environmental factors?
Complications during birth, prior to birth, low birth weight, early preborn children, also problems in the family can make ADHD worse, for example. There's a lot that we are still trying to explain, also in terms of the environmental factors for ADHD, but those are some.
Now, is it like comparable? Like if you took someone who doesn't have ADHD and someone who has ADHD, is there like when it comes to their biology, I mean, is there a distinct difference that you can point out now? I'm sure with technology now, there's something that could probably pick it up. I don't know if I'm speaking out of term here.
Not really. So we cannot, if like what you're essentially asking is, can I get a diagnosis based on biological factors? And that's not the case. So if we compare thousands of people with ADHD to thousands of people without ADHD based on their genetic factors, we do see differences. But they are so small that in an individual, they don't have any meaning. So it's not like we're going to use it, or yet at least we're going to use it in diagnostics. But we're seeing some differences, and that gives us some ideas about the biology that plays a role in ADHD.
Now, you mentioned before about adults with ADHD that it wasn't really known before that if adults had ADHD. Why is it accepted with kids, but it wasn't accepted with adults?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, kids, and especially if you look at what is generally thought as being ADHD, people that are, or kids that are hyperactive, running around, etc., that you don't see adults doing that. So I guess the presentation in adults is different, and in that it wasn't really known or really accepted that there was ADHD also in the adults, but then with a little bit difference in the symptoms.
Now, when we talk about adult ADHD, like masking would be a good example of people like hard to diagnose for ADHD, but like, does it manifest differently? Like, let's say if I have hyperactivity as a kid, and I was super hyper all the time. If that hyperactivity ever goes away, I mean, can you look at it like that with certain, I wouldn't say genetic factors, but there's different subtypes of ADHD. Some people experience things that I never experience. And I'm wondering if that continues into adulthood or do they pick up something else?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not a clinician. Let me say that what I would say here is, first of all, that indeed there's a lot of differences between people with ADHD in how their ADHD expresses itself, and there's also differences in children and adults. And children really run around. In adults, the hyperactivity, the lack of rest is really more in their head than it is in expressing itself in motor activity, I would say. So people are saying I can't get my head to rest. It's always I'm
Constantly
always
moving.
thinking. Yeah, you can probably say it much better than I can. What's really happening in your head?
Now, is there, with technology that we have today, is there a way to be able to diagnose before a kid's born if they have there's no way to do that, but it's just, are we just going off the basis that if a parent has ADHD, like one of my family, I think it's my dad that has ADHD. So then it's heredity, just gets passed down to me. Is that 100% like a guarantee? So it's not.
No. People that have parents with ADHD or a brother or a sister have an increased risk of getting ADHD. But it's definitely not 100% because it's not only one gene. It's a combination of many genetic factors that come together. And if your parent has many of those factors, it's more likely that a certain number of them will also be inherited by you. And that gives you a bigger risk of having ADHD.
And that doesn't mean the same ADHD symptoms. Like my parent could have different ADHD symptoms than I do. Is there an explanation of why there would be, it manifests in a different way? I mean, besides like it's not just environmental factors, is it?
Well, we don't really know yet. It can just be a little bit difference in how your brain is wired that causes differences. The combination of environmental factors, the combination of genetic factors that you carry compared to your parent, that will probably be the reason for differences in your presentation. Yeah, in your symptoms.
And what, through your work, what characteristics do you see with ADHD? I guess what impacts them the most? Like what problems do you see that would impact them most with someone with ADHD?
Well, we're looking at, so again, I'm a biologist and a molecular biologist by training. So in terms of the symptoms, I have to resort to literature and the experience that I have with some people. What is important is that people with ADHD have, well, problems more often in many different aspects of life, and that is related to health, more co-occurring disorders, conditions, not only in terms of mental conditions, but also when you look at cardiometabolic, so obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases are more frequent in ADHD than in people without ADHD. And now we also know that even old age diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease are more frequent in people with ADHD. So that is, in terms of the health related issues, there is already quite some stuff. Then in terms of social interactions, we know that people with ADHD have more difficulties in retaining friendships for a long time, in having successful marriages. These are things that are important there. And if you look at work and school, we see more school dropouts, and we see also more problems in retaining a job.
Is there research on why that there's cardiovascular disease is more prevalent and also obesity is more prevalent?
Yeah, we know that there's a genetic component, and we have done research there, and we find that the genetic component may be just due to behavior, so that people with ADHD have more difficulty, for example, in eating healthy, eating not too much. There's impulsive eating in people with ADHD, which causes overweight, for example. That is more frequent. And then through overweight, you may come to cardiometabolic problems, cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, for example. So it may be just a behavioral component here that causes this additional risk.
Like the seeking of dopamine. I mean, you could probably get that type of rush or that type of stimulant from eating, or I mean, that's where addiction comes in as well too. I mean, drugs and all that comes in. It's that stimulating factor that people with ADHD tend to be seeking out.
Yeah, that could be very well the case, that it is through what we know in terms of differences in the reward system in the brain, that this is indeed one of the factors that contributes.
Now, is there any way to do an intervention when it comes to some of those things that lead to cardiovascular disease or any of those types of things? Besides, like, I know task initiation could be things for like people dealing with memory, but if you're talking about something that's like cardiovascular disease or obesity, I mean, I can't tell people what to eat besides giving them a diet plan, but I'm wondering if there's something in there that either falls more of like I'm not going to say pharmacological side, but something that goes in there that can help out with some people's interactions who necessarily can't do it themselves.
Well, I think here the psychological support is quite important. You can people can be taught to be less impulsive, to react less impulsive, to be more structured in their eating, for example. And I think that is a very good one. We have worked, for example, in one of the research projects with making recipes for people that are easy to follow, that don't take too much time, presenting them with the ingredients that they have to get from the supermarket, etc., in an online version, so that it is easy to try to be more structured in your eating.
Now, I know that's more of the physical side of things, but when it comes to the cognitive decline, I mean, do you notice a certain thing with ADHD compared to someone with non-ADHD where their mental capacity or anything of that sort starts to degrade maybe slower or faster than someone who doesn't have ADHD?
This is a field that is now starting to be developed, because we now know that there is adult ADHD, and that even people at old age can still have ADHD. We also are looking now more into old age consequences of having ADHD, and indeed this risk of cognitive decline, risk of Alzheimer's disease, risk of Parkinson's disease are bigger in people with ADHD. Where that is coming from, we don't yet really know. It could be something that is related to what I just said. Cardiovascular problems also go along with cognitive decline. It's also a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So you may, through this route, also go towards more cognitive decline in ADHD, but we don't really know yet the exact causes of why this is happening.
It's been something that's been said to me through a couple experts I've talked to, which is about the difference between the ADHD brain and the non-ADHD brain. When it makes me seem like I'm a whole separate species when they start really explaining it down there. I mean, is it that distinctive a difference, or if it's just the way our brains are just set up a little bit different, like certain areas that grow or certain areas that don't grow?
Yeah, so there is no real difference between people with
All right, thank
ADHD
God.
and non-people and people without ADHD in terms of their brain. We see again, this is large scale studies where we put thousands of people with ADHD and without ADHD into scanners, into the magnetic resonance imaging, and then look at certain parts of the brain, and we see differences. And that these differences are particularly there in children. So what it looks like is that the brain in ADHD matures a little bit different, and perhaps a little bit later. We don't know that yet, and it may be different, a difference between different brain regions as well. But it looks like it's there. There are some differences, but it's not a big difference. And if you compare a person with a certain size of a brain region with another one, then it's not like there can be people with ADHD and without ADHD having exactly the same size of a certain brain region. So it's definitely also not something that we can use in diagnostics, because it's just the very, very small differences.
They've mentioned the maturity. I know they said the average mature age of the brain is like 25 or something like that. But then when it comes to ADHD, it's like your 30s, which I mean explains a lot about my immaturity. But to me, I was wondering if there's actually any evidence to support that. Besides, I mean, seen some papers on it, but I haven't really seen like a whole like some people either say it's like a controversial thing if it's 30, early 30s or it's mid 30s.
Yeah, and also here, so the brain matures in stages, and there's a lot of parts of the brain, especially the older parts of the brain, and the inner parts of the brain that mature quite early. So you're thinking about 8, 10 years of age already that these regions are mature. Those are, for example, the regions that harbor the reward system, etc., etc. So, and then you have the regions like the prefrontal cortex, this part, which is really a control area of the brain, and that one is in all people the last to mature, and that one is indeed in the 20s somewhere that it really matures, and after that it goes down again. So we're at our best in the 20s, 30s. And after that, we're declining in terms of our brain health again.
Now, some of your research on adult ADHD, what are some areas that you guys do have good, solid research on when it comes to adult ADHD? And when did that start being open to having the conversation about adult ADHD? Was that 8, 10 years ago when they started accepting it more, or was it? I would have to think they always focused on kids for the longest time.
Yeah, they have, and there's still a big lack of studies in adults with ADHD. And I saw that one of your blogs was about was with Steve Farron, and Steve Farron is one of the pioneers in this field of adult ADHD, and he was able to show that there is a continuity of behavior from childhood to adulthood, which really showed that there's adult ADHD, which you see in people that also have childhood ADHD. So that was a very important factor in accepting adults also having ADHD. But it is something that is still not really very well known in the general population. And many of the adults with ADHD still get their diagnosis because their child is being diagnosed with ADHD, and they think, wait a minute, this is what I've had all my life. And that is when they also go to be diagnosed and get the diagnosis of ADHD. There is still a lot of lack. And if you're asking what is really the area that we have best evidence, well, we know that it's also very heritable. So it's not only the heritability in childhood ADHD, but also in adults with ADHD. We know that the genetics of adult ADHD is a little bit different from the genetics of childhood ADHD. So apparently other genes in the adult brain are also important for keeping the ADHD also in adult age.
So the genetics change along the way? Like the ADHD genetics just adapt and affect, I guess, is that because the brain develops later, or is there another factor that comes into play?
Well, it is probably because the brain develops, huh? And the genetic factors are important in what the cells are doing in the brain. And the cells are doing something different once the brain is really mature than they were doing when the brain was still maturing. So the expression, the type of genes that is expressed in the brain and is active in the brain is different in childhood than it is in adulthood. And that probably explains why certain genes are no longer important in adults for ADHD, and other genes come in and are important for adult ADHD than childhood ADHD.
Do you trust the diagnosis and assessment for ADHD? It seems like I'm coming across a lot of people that have ADHD or have been diagnosed with ADHD. I'm seeing it more prevalent than what I guess when I was a kid, and I didn't know if the tools or the equipment was getting better, or we're having better ways of doing it, or if there's just certain things that are getting lumped in.
If the diagnosis is done in a structured way, like it's supposed to do, supposed to be, I have trust in the diagnosis of ADHD, definitely. That the fact that it seems to be coming more and more is because it's getting more known. We still see that in many countries, adult ADHD is underdiagnosed. We see that girls with ADHD are still underdiagnosed because they behave differently than the prototype, you could say, of or stereotype of ADHD, which is based on a young boy running around and having a very typical presentation of ADHD.
Now, is there a genetic factor of why women display ADHD differently than men?
We haven't found any indications for that yet, at least.
It's interesting because I've always heard it's a little bit more emotional. Like I have a friend who's a girl who has ADHD, and a lot of her emotional stuff, I think it, but I just don't have like the severity, I guess, that she has. Maybe it's just my ADHD is a little bit different. But she mentioned about like I have to do work 6 days a week and I could still barely afford this and some days. And then she says something, I go, that's exactly how my brain works, except I don't voice that because then you get looked at like you're crazy. So I mean, to me, it's different because when you're trying to really understand ADHD, you look at what all the varying subtypes are, and then you're wondering how these all develop in so many different ways. I mean, I have more of the compulsivity and the hyperactivity, where a friend of mine has more of like the anxiety that kind of rolls with it, and a bunch of other factors when it comes to like not listening at all. So to me, I'm like, if that's an environmental thing, if that's just how we grow up, but then also how does trauma affect that as well too?
I'm sorry, the last one I didn't catch.
Or I said trauma. How does trauma affect that as well too? There's a lot of factors that go into what can affect a person's personality, obviously, and the way they go through life. But to me, trying to understand, like, I think it's diagnosing it and then assessing it, but also being able to point out that it does exist, because for the longest time, people just didn't believe it. I mean, what do you think the future for ADHD is? I mean, better tools, better technology, better assessment.
All of those. But I think what is important is really that we're trying to go more into a more balanced view on ADHD. Yeah? What is more and more important is that we're not only looking at deficits. And yeah, you, for example, you're very successful in what you're doing,
Not at
and
all.
probably your ADHD gives you an edge in this and gives you an advantage in this niche that you're in. And this is, I think, one of the most important things that will change, that we're looking more into what can people with ADHD do. Where do strengths lie? Where do protective factors lie? How can we also sort of engineer the environment for people with ADHD to develop in a better way, to develop along their strength and be less bothered by the deficits that come along with ADHD.
Well, that's a societal change, isn't it?
That's a societal change, yeah. But I think we're at this point where we see clearly that the school system as it is now is absolutely not conducive to giving people with ADHD, and for that for the same goes for the same with for children with, well, boys. Let's say boys. Sitting still for hours and hours is not conducive to learning in people who want to move. So I think we're learning more and more that we have to change things, and that things can go better if we're using a different approach, and that people don't have to be scarred by their early environment so much that they lose self-esteem and are not able to be the best person that they can be.
I mean, are you optimistic that society will change in those factors for people with? I'm not so optimistic. I mean, I have every reason to hate the education system for what I went through, but I've seen some articles of what they've done, like we talk about yoga or something of that sort of looking at nutrition, which I think are great starts. I just don't think it's getting implemented at the point of where it probably should be implemented. Maybe I just have high expectations for where we're at today in society for what they should be implementing in there.
Yeah, it's early days with that. So, but I think we're through working very closely with people who have ADHD, so bringing researchers and people with ADHD together, bringing clinicians together, bringing the policymakers into the mix as well, early on in research will help us to also get the things better implemented that we find in research. And I think that is well, I know that this is a way that we are currently approaching things, doing more in co-design, doing more in co-creation with a number of different stakeholders that gives really better implementation possibilities.
Now, for technology, do you think that technology would also assist people with ADHD? Because with Jeff Copper, he was describing how difficult it is now that everything's becoming online. So you kind of get sucked into a trap. If you have ADHD, you could tend to go down the wrong thing because you're trying to focus on one thing and you can't because there's a million things on your screen. And I think a lot of people experienced that during the pandemic when they do online learning or online work or something of that sort, where, I mean, how do we equip technology to do for the benefit of the ADHD mind? Because there are a lot of things that distract me. I'll be on the internet for 4 hours and not remember what I did on the internet.
Yeah, that's definitely, and I don't know whether your ADHD has anything to do with that, because I hear a lot of that from many people. So it's of course that's a danger, but there's also the possibility to have apps that help you structure your day, that remind you when things go wrong, when you're too late going to bed, things like that. So in that way, technology can really help the people with ADHD. And I think also we're working towards more objective measures of to support diagnosis and also to support monitoring of people with ADHD, so that we can, in a more tailored way, actually help the person structure their life, not get stuck in their impairments so much.
How do you currently monitor people with ADHD?
Well, this is early days, so we're not yet doing that, but there's a lot of possibilities. Think about wearables, think about what is it called? Ecological momentary assessment, so that people can ask you questions, shoot a question to your smartphone, I don't know, a number of times a day, asking about your mood, asking about what you're at that moment doing in terms of, are you distracted? Are you focusing on a certain task, for example? There are ways to assess impulsivity. So I think it can work. There are ways to measure sleep. So we can go towards more supported diagnostic tools, more supported monitoring of people.
I
And
don't know.
sometimes it sounds a little bit like Big Brother is watching you. So that is the other thing. So where does it become a burden to be followed in that way? And that, I think, is something that everybody has to decide for themselves if they want that. But it can help.
Yeah, but I mean, people have to sign consents before they use those devices. So that's an agreement right there for them to use it. But I think it's important if you're talking about memory issues, because a lot of people are experiencing huge memory issues when it comes to ADHD. I get it a little bit, like I'm pretty good. I have everything task oriented and set out kind of as a planning list, but I, memory is a big one, and then when it comes to sleep as well too. I don't think people really look at or examine ADHD and sleep or understand ADHD and sleep so thoroughly because it is a big problem. There's a large percentage of people that experience sleep issues with ADHD, and I have no why. I probably sleep 3 hours a night, but I'm still kind of functioning.
3 hours, wow.
It's a good 3 hours though. For some reason, I hit that deep cycle. I don't know what it is, but it feels like I've been asleep for 10 years, but I wake up, it's only been like 3 hours. I have no idea why, but I feel rested and everything. It's probably going to affect me later in life. I could tell you that much.
Yeah, well, it is an active area of research, and people get very interested in it. And it's a little bit of a spiral. People with ADHD tend to be evening persons, I hear, and tend to do a lot of computer tasks, etc., in the evening, which keeps them awake. So their cycle, their rhythm goes later and later, and if you have to get up early to go to work, that's becoming a problem then. So there's a lot of issues there. Also, insomnia is an issue in ADHD, and we don't really understand yet why that is. It's probably something to do with balance of certain mechanisms in the brain, and we know that it is partly genetic and partly heritable to have sleeping problems, and the two hang together, ADHD and sleeping problems, genetically as well.
Have you ever been to one of the ADHD conferences?
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to ask you to explain your experience, but when you go there and they're talking about research, I mean, does that's where probably some of your optimism gets boosted in there as well too, when a lot of these people are breaking it down? Or I've had some people give negative reviews on some of the conferences just because it's neurotypicals that are technically examining data. I trust someone who has ADHD that's studying ADHD because there's like the experience side, which you necessarily don't get if you don't have ADHD. But also, I'm appreciative as hell to the people that are researching it that don't have it because we need that too.
Yeah, and the combination is what makes it stronger, and that is what I was mentioning with the collaboration between people with ADHD and researchers, for example. So the organizations for people with ADHD are now very closely working with us for us to ask the right questions, for doing things that are relevant for people with ADHD. So that really helps. The analysis is helped by people with ADHD. So I'm very happy with this very close contact, and I have very good experiences in that.
Now, besides society changing to make it a little bit easier for people with ADHD, is there any other factors that you've noticed through your experience that could be changed?
Well, I think the diagnosis, if you look at psychiatry in general, then this is really the last specialty in medicine where we don't have any markers other than diagnostic interviews and questionnaires. So I think that is an area that will change, and my group is also working on that, trying to see how we can build in biological knowledge into diagnosis and treatment. Can we make the treatment more tailored to the individual person? Does it have to be medication for everyone? Are there people who are better or equally well off with a change in diet? Are there people that can be helped through better monitoring of sleep, etc., etc.? So what is it that everybody needs can be improved, I think. And in general, the understanding, so that we're treating ADHD based on really the mechanisms that are underlying ADHD, and knowledge where we can interfere.
Do you like the word ADHD? I've seen a lot of people, researchers, that have a problem with the word because it's not an attention deficit. It's not, they just don't like the word of
It's
it.
deficit and disorder oriented. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I use it as ADHD, not so much thinking about what it stands for. It's just a way of character, or of mentioning an entity, but I'm open to every other possibility of giving it a better name. Absolutely.
I've seen a lot of people that were in support of giving it a new name because there's a heavy stigma that comes behind the word ADHD. I mean, I've had people on the show that tell me it doesn't exist, and I'm just like, okay, guy, like you're listening to, but that's someone else's experience. I can't just sit there and try and change. You're not going to be able to change anybody's experience. But I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that there is something different going on with certain people. I think that comes with also more people speaking out about having ADHD and advocacy, and also research like yourself that you have. But is there one area that you've throughout your career in this where you haven't had enough data to support a conclusion on a certain thing about ADHD? It doesn't necessarily have to be something we've already discussed, but something that it just the research, whether the sample was too small, whether it was just something that couldn't be reported again.
Mm. Well, we've come a long way in the last, what is it, 10 years, I think, as you're saying, in terms of the biology. And we've been doing genetic studies for more than 30 years in ADHD as a field. But the first 20 years have essentially not resulted in anything that's reproducible, let's say it like that, because we have if you look at the genome, it's very complex. There's a lot of genetic variation between people. And what we did in the first 20 years of genetic research was to make hypotheses about single genetic variants to be involved in ADHD, and testing it in 100 people versus 100 people, 100 people with ADHD, 100 people without ADHD. And it turned out that many of those factors were not found in once they had been discovered once, they were not found again in a second study. So it's in the last 10 years, we have learned how to do genetic studies. We have been able to put aside the egos of the researchers and make them work together, bring all their data together in large studies. And now we're working with data sets of, what is it? The last one was, I think, 46,000 people with ADHD and nearly 200,000 without ADHD. So we have a lot of data now. And the next one will be that we're working on, the next study, genetic study, will be 150,000 people with ADHD and over 1 million people
Holy
without
crap.
ADHD. So yeah, it's that is definitely different piece of cake and a different experience.
That sample size is huge. I'm surprised that many people stepped forward about it. I mean, that shows that the stigma is kind of dying down a little bit, but
yeah, but also that researchers are more working together. So everybody is putting the data that he or she has into this one study to really give us the power to find these genetic factors.
why was there such a refusal to do that before? You mentioned the ego thing, which I've come across ivory tower syndrome, I think it is, between some academics and stuff like that. But I've noticed through the ones I've talked to, there's varying different opinions. Like this is a controversial one, this is a controversial area of ADHD. But I don't know. To me, it just seems like, I mean, all perspectives in this matter is kind of a helping hand, not necessarily anybody who's necessarily 100% over the other.
Yeah. You're right. I'm saying egos. You can also say, well, we all of us depend on funding from the taxpayer. NIH is in the US is giving a lot of funding. The EU is giving funding. The different councils in different countries give funding for research. But there is much more research to be done than there is funding for it. So people have been competing for funding. And that for a very long time has made that that researchers tended to keep a lid on what they were researching, for others not to scoop them, not to be earlier, not to publish earlier, and to have enough uniqueness to be competitive in obtaining funding. And this sentiment has changed. So, and also the funding agencies now reward team science much more than they did before. So there is a change in the atmosphere, in how science works. We've gone from individual researcher based science to team science, and that's a very, very good place to be. So I love really doing research on ADHD in the current time.
Now, not just with researchers, but with also care physicians, do you see that there's a lot of people changing their mind or more than willing to look at ADHD where before that they're not really like, I've noticed that too. Like even my doctor's like, you ever get tested for ADHD? I was like, yeah. It was like, if you check on my chart, I don't know how far back it goes, but I was diagnosed with it as a kid. I've just seen that whether it's the younger care physicians that are coming in or the younger generation of people that are coming in. I don't know if it's the older generation starting to change their mind a little bit about things, but I think it's definitely, I don't know from your perspective, if you think it's probably a mixture of it's multifactorial there.
Yeah, and a lot is based on more knowledge, and the younger clinicians, they are being taught about ADHD in childhood, ADHD in adulthood, so they know that they can look for it and how to look for it. So that is definitely changing, but we're now running a course on ADHD for clinicians from many different European countries, and you see still a lot of differences between countries and acceptance and treatment of ADHD in different countries. In many Eastern European countries, very hard, and Southern Europe, some of the Southern European countries, very hard to get treatment for adults with ADHD because it's still not accepted, and that's really problems that we still have to deal with. And to get it also in these countries and in all countries, an accepted diagnosis and an accepted treatment.
Is there a difference between the countries, like when it comes to assessment tools or anything that's more effective on being able to diagnose ADHD in someone? And also, is there varying factors when it comes to maybe some ADHD types? Like, I don't know how many people experience hyperactivity. I thought that was always the most prevalent out of them all. I thought you had to have the hyperactivity aspect to it. And I realized, no, you don't have to have the hyperactivity. And it's probably not as frequent as I thought it was.
Yeah. In adults, it's mostly the inattention more than it is the hyperactivity. I don't think there's stark differences between countries in how ADHD presents itself. There's also not huge differences in how it is diagnosed, luckily, because there's a lot of effort is being put into having validated scales that are internationally available and validated interviews that are internationally available. So that, I think we're doing quite well, especially in the ADHD field. ADHD, if it comes to it, is not so hard to diagnose, I hear from the clinicians, because it's relatively easy to assess. You have two domains, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. Whereas things like schizophrenia, like depression, they are even more variable than ADHD is, and harder to find in a person.
I wanted to ask, because you mentioned before about medications. I mean, are you open to the idea of using other forms of medications besides just the one that was Adderall or something of that pharmacological sort? Like, obviously, people might have a different experience. I'm not saying asking for any recommendation advice. When I was talking to Steve on my show, he had mentioned, no, take the Adderall. The Adderall works. I'm like, man, I'm 25 years old and I've never taken it before. I feel like I want to try and use it to my advantage. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And I get it. It's a controversial subject about the medication aspect to it. But to me, I'm just looking at like, I don't know, varying people's opinions on it. I mean, does it hinder anything with our brains as well, too? I'm not against it at all. I'm just saying, I'm looking at like, I think everything in this case, if someone wants to take something, they should be able to take something.
I'm again, I'm not a clinician, so I'm my expertise and also the meaningfulness of what I'm saying is limited here. But I think that people should try what works for them. Especially with ADHD, many of the medications work very acutely, and there are many people who take the ADHD medication when they need it. And I think that's fine. If it is a model that works for you, that's fine. And yeah, there are different types of medication. If one doesn't work for you, then try a different one.
Now you meant
And if it
now
is not Medicare, there are not enough people who don't like to themselves when they are medicated. So there may be other ways for them to work with their ADHD.
you mentioned with seniors and ADHD. I mean, that end of life when it comes to when you get towards the end there when you're a senior. I'm just curious, is there like obviously there's significant drop-offs of certain functions and certain things of that sort. I mean, does it get harder to treat? Is it anything with ADHD that you can obviously point out and be like, there's this that's still prevalent, there's this that's not, there's this, and there's I would feel like towards the end it starts weaning off a little bit. Some of the ADHD, they probably don't have the hyperactivity, or if you do, you're just sitting and watching TV and flipping through the channels constantly. But I don't know if there's obviously distinct markers you can tell when it comes to a senior, or if the research is even there yet.
That's a good point. That is an area where there's few experts and relatively little knowledge yet. And what I hear is that the older a person gets, the more difficult it is to distinguish ADHD from, for example, a starting Alzheimer's disease. And there, I think we will have to find ways to educate people, clinicians, in what they should do and what they shouldn't. There's a lot of unclarity and feeling of not being an expert when it comes to elderly with ADHD. That's all I can say about that
No,
one.
the Alzheimer's one scares me because my grandmom had Alzheimer's. That's how she went. So, I mean, when you're looking at like genetic factors of like if my grandma might have had ADHD, I would like to know if that's going to be something that's going to be prevalent in my lifetime. Hopefully not. But my memory is not good as it is. I don't know.
Mm.
I have to.
But as for Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of things that you can do to prevent it. Keep active. There's all these things that live a healthy life. Don't overeat. Sleep enough. Things like that. It is important, and it may be even more important for people with ADHD to adhere to that to reduce the risk that they have. Yeah.
No, I think with the research that you guys have done, especially if it's child, adult, all that, it's good for education, especially when it comes to ADHD, because then you can extend the long care when it comes to how it's going to affect them when they get to old age. I mean, extending the life, I looked it up. I mean, life expectancy says it's like 13 years shorter. I don't know that that's an exact science to prove that, or if that's based on risk taking or whatever they want to say. But that's a scary thing when you read it. And it's like, so people with ADHD have a shorter life expectancy. And whether like it's some of the things we talked about earlier about cardiovascular, any of those types of sorts, it's still a scary thing to just read that. And when you have ADHD.
Yeah, well, and I think it becomes even scarier because many of the reasons for people to have a lower life expectancy is because of accidents and suicide. And the suicide, that one I think is the most scary one because it may be preventable if we're better at diagnosing ADHD and treating ADHD in people.
That's also a society issue as well, too. There's a large factor of shame that comes in with ADHD. And when you have one of those very shameful and depression days, and the next day you might just take a nap and it might be better. But when you have one of those, it feels like this is it, like this is everything. And I've seen that. Like I know men already kind of have a higher percentage of like on the suicide thing, but then you get into the ADHD factors and it's like doubled that. And it's like, well, every emotion's doubled when you have ADHD. So I think that's going to be with the society thing. I think it has to evolve to a point to more comfortability and acceptance. But through your experience and career, I mean, well, you've learned so much about ADHD, but if you couldn't have looked up ADHD, if you couldn't have researched ADHD, if this wouldn't have been dropped in front of you, if you wouldn't have been paired with someone to look into this, where would you have gone?
Hmm.
Have you ever thought about that?
Um,
That's like a tough question to ask because I'm asking you to dig back a little bit, but I think that's like really interesting to me is like how people get involved into the ways that they get involved into things.
yeah. Well, I looked into many conditions. I've worked on spina bifida. I've worked on dyslexia, aortic aneurysms, etc., etc. And what really um, caught my attention most were the brain related things. And really, I think ADHD is special in that uh, it it is something that is both a strength because people with ADHD are often great to be with. But on the other hand, people with ADHD also have a lot of problems with in fitting in, essentially. And so that is, I think, why I stuck with this research most.
Well, I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about some of your work. And I know we covered a wide range of topics, which I tend to do sometimes. But I appreciate your time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links, any papers, any sites that you like to promote if you have a Twitter or anything like that?
I have a Twitter. I'm not very active on it. But yeah, if you look at my name in the literature, you will find a few papers that you
And
could read.
I'll link all those in the description. I actually got one last question for you, but do you know why ADHD and autism get brought up in sometimes the same conversation? I can edit this out if you want, but I hear it too much. And then I looked it up on my phone and apparently it's on the spectrum, which I didn't know about for the longest time. And I just want to know if there's like a distinct, like you kind of gave me the head nod like that, like, yeah, kind of. So I'm curious, is there like a line? Is it like, it's not like 100% like autism. It's something that might be a mix in between.
Not necessarily. So for a very long time, ADHD and autism could not be diagnosed together. Only in the last versions of the diagnostic interviews you can diagnose ADHD and autism together. It is something that occurs more than by chance together. So there is something that underlies that. What people have thought about is whether that is really a biological factor that binds the two, or whether people with autism are attracted to people with ADHD, and it may be just through that that their children may have an increased risk of having both autism and ADHD. I think the absolute answer to that is still open. But there may be more than one reason actually why it comes up together.
I had to ask that because I see so many different answers on it. So I was just, me, I was like, I need to know if there's any weight to this because you look it up and it says you're on the spectrum, you get a little bit scared. But look, I appreciate the time. I'm going to link all your links in the description. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.